Morning everybody. Well, as most of you know, I shoot with a Nikon Z8, but as probably a lot of you know as well, I do take people out teaching photography, both landscape and wildlife photography, and so I always need a backup camera. Now, I've got no issues with the Nikon Z50 handling landscape photography, but how does it handle wildlife photography? Well, this week I'm exclusively shooting with the Z50, and I'm going to try and find out. So firstly, I thought it would be a good test to see how the Z50 would handle mammal photography. I decided to stake out a field I'd used in a video with the Z8 a couple of weeks ago, as I've got a good understanding of roe deer movements through here, and these should provide a pretty good test. And now it's just a case really of setting up in a suitable position, and as normal the wait will begin. And to be honest, I actually thought I'd messed this one up, as a couple of deer shot through in front of me and I'd gone down to the far end of the field before I could get a shot off. But luckily for me, they didn't disappear into the adjoining field but started to make their way back towards me. The light was very poor, but I managed to lock the Z50 on and take some footage as well as stills. The autofocus while in video locked on well, which I expected with walking deer. Nothing here to test the autofocus, and the same could be said for the stills. A really impressive start for the Z50. Now, one thing to remember is that the Z50 doesn't have animal autofocus as we know it. Somewhere in the menus it will distinguish between dogs and cats, but for this test I didn't use it, and I just stuck to a wide area autofocus, which worked really well. The autofocus obviously feels more basic than the Z8, and it should be, being a fraction of the price, but I have to say that at no point shooting the deer did I ever find myself thinking the Z8 would have helped to produce better images. The Z50 did a fine job. Now, I had expected the Z50 would do well here because for me mammal photography tends to be much more about the photographer's skill in getting into position to get a shot rather than anything to do with the camera. In low light levels you will have issues with smaller crop sensors of more noise. However, with current noise reduction software being so good, this can usually be corrected in post-processing, so isn't generally an issue. Now, the shots you see in here were shot at high ISO, around 5000 to be exact, as the light levels were so poor. I would recommend here some good noise reduction software, and as you can see here, the DxO Pure Raw that I used did a fantastic job. And to be honest, the images were pretty much on par with the Z8 image I took from here a couple of weeks ago. So here's a quick comparison from the Z8 shot and one from the Z50. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. So in conclusion, for shooting mammals, I think the Z50 does a great job. But before I increase the difficulty level, let's take a look at some of the specs of this tiny little camera. Now, the Z50 has a sensor that is quite small for the modern crop sensor cameras coming out at 20.9 megapixels. The ISO ranges from 100 to 51,200, and it will record video at 4K at 30 frames a second, and it'll also shoot 11 frames per second with the mechanical shutter, and it weighs in at a tiny 450 grams. Now, I'll scroll through more specs here so you can stop the video if you want to check them out. Now, as the mammal photography had gone so well, I headed off to a local nature reserve to see how the Z50 would handle birds. For me, a much tougher proposition, and I knew that any weaknesses were likely to show up here. Straight away I was getting sightings of small birds in the undergrowth. I can't say I blame them because it was absolutely freezing out there on that day. As I didn't have eye detect and the wide area autofocus was hitting every branch and twig it landed on, I went back to the old faithful single spot autofocus, and the Z50 started to latch on. Now, I can't really say that this is an indictment of the Nikon Z50 because I often find I'm doing exactly the same thing with the Z8, and again, this is not an indictment on the Z8. It just so happens that at present most eye autofocus systems will fail in the most challenging situations, a moving bird within a berry covered bush, then the autofocusers will at times hit on something else that looks like an eye. Indeed, I know marketing guys really push eye autofocus, but as a photographer I find it generally works best in the easy situations where you don't need it. A deer walking slowly towards you is easy enough for me to stick a single spot focus on its eye. However, where it's brilliant is for recomposing a shot when you have focus on the eye. The focus will stay on the eye and allow the photographer to move around within the shot to get a more pleasing composition while still sticking to that eye. Now moving on to birds in flight, and here I did start to feel that I was missing shots that the Z8 would have nailed. The focus is slower to acquire and easier to drop off, but it by no means unusable, and as long as you accept that your keeper rate will be around to about 60%, which it was for me, rather than the 90 to 95 I can get with the Z8, then you're going to be fine. It is completely usable as a camera to shoot birds in flight. But what is important here is to get the best out of the Z50, particularly for bird photography. You need to dial in the best settings. Now if you want me to do a detailed video into the settings I use with the Z50 to maximise my results for birds in flight in particular, drop me a comment below and I'll sort that out for you. Now I think it's also important to recognise that for this test I was using the Nikon 180-600 lens. Now this in my opinion is a fantastic wildlife lens. But to be honest, I'd also like to pair the Z50 with something like the Tamron 50-400 to see if the results are still good for that even more budget friendly option, and again a nice lightweight option. Now let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see a video on that as well. So what about my conclusions? Well, I think if you're a new photographer and on a tight budget, the Nikon Z50 is a good choice. It's not flashy, but it will do the job, and I would always say that when you are just starting out with a camera like the Z50, it's not going to hold you back. It also has the advantage of being fairly simple to use, and I do have clients who come to me with very expensive kit who have no idea where to start to set the camera up for wildlife photography. And more expensive does mean more features, but it also means deeper menus and more complication. It is far more likely that any struggles will be due to you as a new photographer having to learn all the other stuff you need to know, like animal and bird behaviour, tracking skills, stalking skills, and just how to be patient. All these things take time, and as a beginner it will be a good while before you turn into your camera to exclaim, "You just lost me that shot," rather than looking back at yourself. Now these days when I'm looking at cameras, my benchmark for a crop sensor camera is the Sony a6400. A few years ago when I was shooting Sony, I was shooting with two of these in a semi-professional basis. I really do rate these cameras. So how does the Z50 match up? Well, specs are quite similar, but I would put the a6400 just ahead. It seems more solid and just does everything well, but the differences are small and both are very capable. So is the Z50 for you? Well, only you can answer that, and I always encourage people to write themselves a list detailing what type of photographer you are, what you like to shoot, what do you see yourself shooting later. A good example of this is that I now shoot a lot of wildlife videos, so for me this was a big consideration when choosing the Z8. But if you only shoot stills and are not likely to shoot video in the future, there could be a better option out there. Anyway, I hope you found this video useful, especially if you're taking those first steps into wildlife photography. My next video will be on the Nikon Z52 as a wildlife camera, so if you want to know what I think of that, please subscribe and you'll be the first to know when it's out. See you later.